Hey, welcome to lesson 7. This is the 4th lesson in Mesopotamia unit. We're going to learn about Mesopotamian city-states. These city-states began around the rivers, and early cities began around rivers. This is where the farming began, this is where the villages began, and eventually where the cities began. And these cities are actually going to adopt their own government and become their own nation, become called city-states. Some of the world's first cities began in Mesopotamia. Eventually, they end up having their own government called city-states, where they would be not only a city, but also a country, as you think about it today. So their own nation, and they're their own city. And Mesopotamia is made up of several of these city-states rather than one united empire. So Mesopotamia is not a country, it's not an empire, it's really a region full of city-states. These city-states developed their own religion and government, and these were the most powerful institutions in these city-states. You see in this picture here, you have a ziggurat, which is a huge temple that was common in Mesopotamian city-states. And then also in the city-states, you have some palaces, and this is kind of the vertical view or the sky view of what a palace would look like in Mesopotamia. The most powerful people were the priests or priestesses and the kings. And here's a picture of Nebuchadnezzar, who was a famous king of Babylon, which is located in Mesopotamia. So priests were extremely powerful people. They were the go-between between the people and the gods, and they served as both the leader of religion and government early on. Eventually, you're going to add a king, but even after you add a king, the priests are going to have power in the government. They were in charge of religious activities to please the gods. This includes making sacrifices, leaving food for the gods, performing rituals, and building shrines to please the gods. You have a picture of the goat here. Goats were very commonly sacrificed in a way to please the gods. They're also involved in the government. Early on, they pretty much ran the government, but even after they give up some of their power to the king, they're still in charge of writing and enforcing laws, serving as judges, and controlling land ownership and trade, and stay very involved in the political side of the city. Eventually, you have kings develop. As city-states become more complex and the government becomes more complex, you need another leader to help out with the government so that the priests and priestesses could devote more attention to the religious responsibilities of pleasing the gods and goddesses. The main job of the government is to make sure that farming takes place and to make sure that they are protected from lawbreakers and wars. So the main job of the government is to protect the people and oversee farming, particularly building irrigation canals and dams, and then for protection, building walls and raising armies. So the king was also in charge of commanding armies to protect the people from outside and gain land from neighboring areas if they were to attack, and then to oversee farm production to make sure there's a constant food supply to the people so that the people don't starve to death. The kings worked alongside many other people, and these people below them were the government officials. It was kind of a bureaucracy where he has lots of people working underneath him, including scribes, which would be like modern-day lawyers, not trial lawyers, but lawyers who were in charge of understanding the law, and tax collectors. And once again, Mesopotamia is the first region or first civilization to really have taxes or impose taxes on its people. We talked about Code of Hammurabi in the last lesson. The Code of Hammurabi was a way for King Hammurabi to maintain law and order in his city-state, which would be Babylon. And he was a famous Babylonian king. He's credited with producing the Code of Hammurabi, which is the oldest surviving set of laws ever published and written down. So he's given a nickname, Hammurabi the Lawgiver. There's 282 codes, most of which we still have. There's a few that are missing. They have a prologue, kind of introduction, and epilogue, kind of a conclusion to these laws. Public works was very important. This was one way they maintained the city, and they had people perform duties using them as their labor as taxes. And their job was to make sure that they had good food production, that they provided protection, so they would be in charge of digging canals, maintaining the canals, building walls to make sure the city was safe and make sure the people were well fed. In Mesopotamia, taxes were paid usually through physical labor, and thousands of people worked together for these public works projects to build and maintain infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is the basic physical organization structures of the government and community. So today we think about it as roads and bridges and courthouses and schools. Back then it would be buildings such as temples and palaces, but also housing. You have defensive walls, which we'll talk about in a little bit, canals, which we've talked about already a lot, and we'll talk a bit more later, and roads, which would be used for trade and for travel. So the canals were probably the most important, along with the walls. They were dug to direct water to farmland and throughout the city, and sometimes away from farmland and away from the city to prevent damage from flooding and having these things be destroyed. These canals required, once again, a lot of work to build, to maintain, to repair, and if they did not, stay up to date, their farming would suffer and the people would starve to death. You have the defensive walls. These were built around a city for protection from an attack. There are several stories tall in most cases. Some city-states had as many as 3 deep in terms of their walls, and sometimes they were several miles around. You have ziggurats and palaces. Ziggurats were temples to please the gods and show city's prosperity. You have that picture earlier of kind of the pyramid-shaped temple, usually the largest building in a city-state. You have palaces, which is the center of the government, and this is a place where the king and queen were housed, and you'd oftentimes have more than one palace inside a city-state. You also had houses and roads. People worked together to build these. The houses were usually built out of mud bricks or clay, and then reeds, and this is where people lived. And then the roads were made to make travel easier and also to help out with trade or to move the army in case of war. All right, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll talk to you later. Bye.